Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Hey everyone, Craig Baird here. Before I begin today's story, I want to take a moment and ask that you check me out on Patreon at www.patreon.com/CanadaEHX. There are several tiers with great benefits, from ad-free content to t-shirts and other cool stuff. And if you're a fan of Canadian History X, make sure you check out my other shows, From John to Justin and Canada, A Yearly Journey. And don't forget, you can also donate directly to the show at www.canadaehx.com. It helps keep this show going. All right, on with the show. In July 2024, I took my first trip to Ottawa to see the history of our capital city. Over the course of about 6 days, I visited some of Canada's most prestigious museums: the Museum of History, Canadian War Museum, the Diefenbunker, and the Canadian Aviation and Space Museum. At each location, one name kept coming up. When I went for a walk with a friend, she pointed out to me that the building we had just passed was the apartment of that same man. I knew his name and the basics of what he did. He arrived in Canada in the 1940s and made a decision that changed the course of history by setting the stage for the Cold War. I'm Craig Baird, this is Canadian History X, and today we are cracking open some secret files to dive into the spy thriller story of the Igor Gouzenko affair. Canada and the Soviet Union had for the most part a tumultuous relationship. Prior to 1917 and the Russian Revolution, which ended the rule of the Tsar, Canada had little interaction with Russia. Foreign matters were handled by the United Kingdom since we were a mere dominion of the empire. In fact, until 1931, Canada's foreign policy was dictated by the United Kingdom. Following the Revolution in 1923, the Soviet Union set up its first trade representative to Canada, but that warming relationship suffered a rupture 4 years later when it was discovered the Soviets stole classified material from a military base in England. If the United Kingdom didn't like someone, well, Canada didn't either. When the Statute of Westminster was enacted in 1931, Canada gained more powers over its foreign affairs. Despite this, the relationship between the Soviets and Canada did not improve much. As the Great Depression raged, communism was a growing movement within the country. People were looking to replace what they saw as the failed experiment of capitalism. The federal government under R.B. Bennett and the Conservatives were deeply anti-communist and saw any strike or union activity during the early 1930s as a Soviet plot. This greatly impacted foreign relations with any communist country, and things hit a low point in 1939 when the Soviets invaded Poland with Germany, and Canada went to war with the two European powers. But it was not to last. Within 2 years, enemies became friends, and friends became enemies. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was to become the largest and costliest land offensive in human history, leaving 10 million soldiers and 8 million civilians dead. As soon as Germany attacked the Soviet Union, its former ally, it changed sides in the Second World War. The Soviet Union was now on the same side as Canada in the war, and relations between the two countries thawed. In August and September of 1941, Canada led a force to evacuate 2,000 Soviet miners located in German-occupied Norway. Things continued to improve, and in June 1942, Canada and the Soviet Union opened diplomatic relations, and soon after, the Soviets opened their first embassy in Ottawa. As the war went on, Canada's importance among the Allies increased. Canadians were in important positions, and they were given scientific, military, and diplomatic secrets. This included everything from work being done to develop radar to the creation of the first atomic bomb. The Soviets and Canada may have been allies, but it wasn't long before a network of spies began to operate out of the Ottawa embassy, led by Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Zabotin. His work was so secretive that the Soviet ambassador, Georges Zarabun, had no idea what was happening under his nose. And one man who worked with Zabotin was an intelligent officer and cipher clerk by the name of Igor Gouzenko. And he was about to change the 20th century forever. Igor Gouzenko was born on January 26, 1919 in a small village 100 kilometers northwest of Moscow. Of Ukrainian heritage, he was the youngest of 4 children. His older brother, also named Igor, died when he was only 1, and the younger Igor was named after his deceased brother. Gouzenko's early life, though, was not easy. His father died of typhoid while fighting the Bolsheviks during the Russian Revolution, leaving his mom to raise the children alone. Gouzenko's mother taught mathematics, but the revolution made living extra difficult, so she sent her youngest son to live with her mother, Ekaterina, outside Ryazan to the west. Gouzenko lived with his grandmother for the next few years until the revolution ended and he was reunited with his mother. As a young man, Gouzenko was highly intelligent and spent most of his time in the Lenin Library in Moscow, reading books on a wide assortment of subjects. The Lenin Library didn't just broaden his mind, it changed his life. While attending the Moscow Architectural Institute and studying at the library, he met Svetlana Gozova. It was love at first sight, and soon after they met, they married. But their lives were about to change as the Second World War began soon after, and the entire country was thrown into the war effort. Gouzenko was recruited to be a cipher clerk, where he would encrypt and de-encrypt highly secretive messages. He was then drafted into the Red Army and given the rank of lieutenant. He worked directly under Colonel Nikolai Zabotin and gained information about the espionage the Soviets were conducting. After 1 year working in Moscow, Gouzenko was given new orders. He was to accompany Zabotin to Ottawa, where he would handle transmissions to and from Moscow. He was joined by his wife Svetlana, who was pregnant with their first child. They may not have known it at the time, but they would never again return to the Soviet Union. For Gouzenko and his wife, Canada was a revelation. They'd been led to believe that living was tough in capitalist countries such as Canada and the United States. That view was immediately shattered as soon as they arrived. They landed in Edmonton to take a train to Ottawa and saw piles of oranges at the train station. Gouzenko had only tasted an orange once in his life, and he was shocked by the abundance. Upon their arrival in Ottawa, the family was given an apartment at 511 Somerset Street. The apartment was by no means large, but it was bigger than anything the Gouzenkos had enjoyed before. He said, "I heard Zabotin remark more than once that living abroad spoiled some Russians. It had certainly spoiled Anna and me. In Ottawa, we had a comfortable apartment of our own. In Moscow, a place that size would have been shared by 4 or 5 families." The fact the family was allowed to live outside the embassy was also unusual. Typically, the Soviet Union kept tight control of its staff, and most lived within the embassy. But the Gouzenkos had a newborn baby named Andrei, and his crying had annoyed Nikolai Zabutin's wife to such an extent that the Gouzenkos were given permission to live away from the embassy. The Gouzenkos were thousands of kilometers from Moscow, but the long arm of the Soviet Union stretched even into their home. Every so often a limousine would pull up and 2 or 3 men would get out and go into the apartment. No one knew who these men were, but they were in fact from the Russian embassy checking on the family. According to Gouzenko's neighbor, Claire Anderson, if you looked up at the Gouzenko home from Somerset Street, the first thing you saw was a large portrait of Joseph Stalin in the living room. She described Gouzenko as a quiet man, as did his neighbor, David Conlon, who said, "He was a very quiet chap, a mousy type of fellow." Meanwhile, Gouzenko and Svetlana were shocked by the abundance they saw around them. They were so taken aback by it that instead of going to the movies, they simply went to the grocery store to look at the amount and variety of food available to purchase. Gouzenko began to love living in Canada, where he could move more freely without police surveillance and openly criticize the government without worry that he would disappear. Within the home, the family rarely talked about what they saw in Canada. They believed, likely correctly, that there were microphones in their home. Svetlana Gouzenko said, Usually we go to the park and would leave the baby carriage a few feet away because the carriage could have a bug. But we would walk away a little bit and then we would discuss, and we would never come near the same tree to discuss matters. We were cautious. Gouzenko talked with his neighbors and asked Margaret MacDonald how much she and her husband paid for their apartment, how much a person had to make to buy a car, or how much furniture a family was allowed. What may have seemed like innocent, if unusual, questions were clues that Gouzenko may not have wanted to return to the Soviet Union. He wasn't just worried about leaving Canada, he was also terrified that if he left, he would never make it to Moscow. He had seen cipher clerks leave for overseas postings, but he never saw them return. During the Stalin era in the Soviet Union, it was common for people to disappear suddenly for the smallest of infractions, or even no infraction at all. Some may have been killed outright, while others were sent to the dreaded Gulag. The Siberian gulags, or forced labor camps, were well known to Soviet citizens. They were used as instruments of political repression and punishment. Between 1930 and 1953, 1.6 million people died in the gulags. Gouzenko was an intelligent man, and he believed the reason cipher clerks were disappearing was because of what they learned on the job. His friend John Picton, a reporter in Ottawa, said he suspected that was going to happen to him because they get to know too much. In September 1944, Gouzenko got the news he was dreading. The family was recalled to the Soviet Union. This was unexpected, as Gouzenko still had 2 years left on his post in Ottawa, and he believed he was being recalled early for either knowing too much or having made a mistake. Either way, it was bad news. That left him with only two choices: return to Moscow and hope he wasn't being sent to a Siberian gulag, or stay in Canada and become a defector. It was a tough choice between death or exile. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, but the war in the Pacific continued, and it was expected to be a long and violent fight to push the Japanese back. That is until August 6, 1945, when the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, followed 3 days later with another on Nagasaki. The bombings killed between 150,000 and 246,000 people. 6 days after Nagasaki was left in ruins, Japan surrendered to the Allies. 2 weeks later, on September 2nd, the surrender documents were signed, and the bloodiest war in human history came to an end. And throughout Canada, people celebrated. You'll remember from my episode about the Halifax riot in early 2024 that some Canadians celebrated a bit too much. But as the party raged across Canada, inside the home of Igor Gouzenko, a decision was made. Gouzenko had been able to delay his departure to Moscow by getting permission from his boss, Nikolai Zabutin, but his time was quickly running out. His replacement, Lieutenant Kulikov, had already arrived in July 1945, and it was only a matter of time before Gouzenko had to leave. With a second child on the way, Gouzenko made the decision to defect. On September 5, 1945, 3 days after the war ended, Gouzenko carried a briefcase full of documents and walked out of the Soviet embassy for the last time. Under his shirt were more documents he had stolen. Svetlana said he had to suck in his stomach the entire time so no one noticed what he was hiding. These documents included the telegrams from Zabutin, pages from his notebook, and information on Allied weapons, including the atomic bomb. Gouzenko had planned it down to the last detail, knowing just how dangerous the situation would be, not only for himself, but his entire family. For months, he had copied and stolen documents slowly and kept them hidden in his home. He knew that to be granted asylum in Canada, he needed to provide something of value to the government. At first, he thought about going to the RCMP because he knew from his work at the embassy that the Soviets did not have military agents in the force. Unfortunately, he wasn't sure that there were no NKVD or KGB agents in the ranks. RCMP officer Cecil Bayfield said, "He was afraid to come to the police in the first place because he didn't trust them. He told us that. He trusted the newspapers, but he didn't trust the police." Not wanting to risk getting caught on the same day he defected, Gouzenko went to the Ottawa Journal and met with the editor-in-chief, but then backed out of making a statement. He left the office only to return later, but the editor-in-chief was not there, and the night editor, Chester Froude, had trouble understanding Gouzenko's broken English. Gouzenko was highly agitated and just kept repeating, "It's war, it's war, it's Russia." Not knowing what else to do, Froude suggested that he go to the RCMP. Still fearful of Soviet spies in the RCMP, Gouzenko went to the Department of Justice instead. Unfortunately, by the time he arrived, the office was closed. What followed was a nerve-wracking night for Gouzenko. He was not under the protection of Canadian authorities, and the Soviets could have burst into his home at any moment after discovering him. But no one came. The next morning, with Svetlana and Andre, he went to the Department of Justice to see Minister of Justice Louis Saint Laurent. Saint Laurent was 3 years away from becoming Prime Minister of Canada, but at the time he was a respected member of Parliament who had held the justice portfolio for 4 years. Gouzenko and his family sat waiting for hours to see him, only to be denied any appointment, and time was running out. It may have seemed like he was getting nowhere, but his visit to the Department of Justice had already raised some eyebrows. Then Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King had been informed by the Under Secretary of State, Norman Robertson, that Gouzenko had gone to see Saint Laurent, claiming he was holding classified Soviet secrets. The war had just ended, and King believed the Soviets were allies who had sacrificed millions of young men to fight against the Nazis on the Eastern Front. He was also terrified of sparking another war, so he wasn't eager to see what Gouzenko was holding. Prime Minister King wanted to find a diplomatic solution to avoid upsetting the Soviet Union. Norman Robertson, the Undersecretary for External Affairs, pushed King to grant asylum to Gouzenko because his life was in danger. King reportedly refused, stating Gouzenko should be handed over. Luckily for Gouzenko, a new man entered his story completely by chance: William Stevenson. William Stevenson was one of the most fascinating Canadians of the 20th century. Born in Winnipeg in 1897, he served Canada during the First World War as a soldier and pilot. Following the war, he invented a method to transmit photographic images via wireless that netted him a fortune, which he used to invest in several industries, which connected him with many governments, including that of Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Through his business contacts, Stevenson discovered that the Nazis were building up their armed forces and hiding billions of dollars in military expenses. And this was a clear violation of the Treaty of Versailles, and he alerted a British MP named Winston Churchill. He used that information to warn against the appeasement policies of the British government at the time. When the Second World War broke out, Stevenson became a spy master, a senior representative for the British Security Coordination under the codename Intrepid. It was his job to hand British scientific secrets to the Americans and relay secrets back to the British. He was also tasked with changing American public opinion from isolationism to entry into the Second World War. He only reported to Winston Churchill. If that wasn't enough to dazzle you, he also trained covert agents including children's author Roald Dahl and Ian Fleming. Fleming allegedly even said the real-life version of James Bond was William Stevenson. So yeah, James Bond is Canadian. By the end of the war, Stevenson, who was now knighted by special request from Winston Churchill, was a very powerful individual, and he just happened to have a dinner reservation at the Royal Ottawa Golf and Country Club with Norman Robertson for September 5th, 1945. When Stevenson called Robertson to ask what time they were meeting for dinner, Robertson told him that things had changed and he needed to get to the country club immediately. A few hours later, while sitting on a couch in the country club, Robertson brought Stevenson up to speed about the Igor Gouzenko situation. Stevenson, the man with every Western leader on speed dial, immediately gave his total support to Robertson to protect Gouzenko, despite what Prime Minister King had ordered. Robertson was to call the RCMP and rescind the order to take Gouzenko into custody and instead place him under surveillance and protective custody. Gouzenko didn't know it, but he had one of the most powerful men in the Western world in his corner. Gouzenko and his family were terrified they had made a decision that was going to cost them their lives. From their perspective, no one seemed to care about the stolen Soviet documents. On the night of September 6, 1945, Gouzenko and his family returned to their apartment, fully expecting to be nabbed by the Soviets. Gouzenko likely knew that rumors would be swirling about him among both Canadian and Soviet operatives in Ottawa. The fact he didn't go into work that day also didn't help to keep his defection a secret. The Soviets had also discovered the missing documents and they were on their way. Gouzenko saw two men out in a car looking up at his apartment. He believed they were Soviets, but they were in fact two RCMP members who had been tasked with monitoring him. But Gouzenko was not going to leave anything to chance. That night, he took his family to the neighbor across the hall and stayed there. And at some point in the middle of the night, 4 NKVD officers burst into the apartment looking for him and the papers he stole. RCMP officers John McCulloch and Tom Walsh, who had been outside the building, went inside and they saw the Russians enter Gouzenko's apartment. McCulloch said, quote, "We got upstairs and here was the door smashed right open. I walked in with my gun in hand and had the whole 4 of them in the parlor as you go in. McCulloch asked them what they were doing, and they stated they were from the Russian embassy and were looking for a cipher clerk named Igor Gouzenko." Across the hall, Igor Gouzenko watched everything unfold from his neighbor's keyhole. The Russians left, empty-handed. Gouzenko knew he couldn't hide forever, and eventually the long arm of the Soviets would find him. Except, there was a man standing in the bushes that night, watching everything unfold. William Stevenson. As soon as the Russians left, the RCMP wanted to transport Gouzenko and his family to a remote lodge in Quebec. Before they could, Stevenson and Tom Stone, the person in charge of secret matters at External Affairs, walked into Igor Gouzenko's apartment. Constable McCulloch said years later. The guy said he was from the Department of External Affairs, but who was he? He didn't show any credentials. First thing in the morning on September 7, 1945, RCMP officers took Gouzenko and his family into protective custody, and took them to the RCMP headquarters where Gouzenko was interrogated. At the same time, the stolen documents he provided were being translated. The secrets they held shook the Canadian government to its core. The government discovered that the Soviet embassy was home to spies who were connected to Soviet spy rings in Montreal, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Through this espionage ring, secrets related to everything from ciphers to atomic bombs were being funneled back to Moscow. By this point, the Soviets were demanding that Gouzenko be handed over, stating he was a thief and had stolen money. Nobody was under any illusions about what would happen to Gouzenko if he was turned over to the Soviets. He would disappear, plain and simple. Canadian authorities stated they did not know where he was, and they sent an RCMP bulletin out to the offices across the country as a ruse, asking for information if Gouzenko appeared in those cities. The Soviets were not fooled. They had a spy named Kim Philby in British intelligence. Philby was the chief counterintelligence at MI6, and he relayed the information to the Russians. The USSR took no action though, not wanting to expose Philby or publicize that Gouzenko had defected. Meanwhile, the Gouzenkos were in a motel room, and in each room on either side were multiple Mounties protecting the family. For the next few weeks, they were shuttled between motels and inns, all while RCMP members followed them in unmarked vehicles. Gouzenko was given the codename of Corby, inspired by a box in Norman Robertson's desk where he kept the stolen Soviet documents alongside a bottle of Corby rye whiskey. Needing to get the family to a secure and secret location, the decision was made to move them to Camp X. Located between Whitby and Oshawa, Ontario, the decommissioned camp was where covert British and Canadian agents were trained to conduct operations in Europe during the Second World War. Established by Sir William Stevenson on December 6, 1941, the day before the attack on Pearl Harbor, it operated until 1944. Svetlana Gouzenko said, "We were told we were going to a different place, but we were told it would take several hours driving away from the Ottawa region." The family would live in an old farmhouse at the former camp alongside with several RCMP members who slept with their revolvers in case the Soviets arrived. As can be expected, tensions were high. One officer, John Dean, said, "It was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and there was a noise outside my window. I got up with revolver in hand and went out through the front door and tried to sneak to the back where I heard the noise. it was a damn cow. While at Camp X, Gouzenko met with representatives from the RCMP, British Secret Service, MI5, MI6, and the FBI at the dining room table. Svetlana said that sometimes there would be 6 or 7 people who would sit around the table talking as Gouzenko answered questions about Russian activities at the embassy, things he saw, and anything else he knew. The government and RCMP did what they could to make the family comfortable as well. Svetlana Gouzenko, pregnant with her second child, was given things like a sewing machine so she could make baby clothes or new clothes for the family. At one point, she asked for a layette. Sir William Stevenson received the request, and he had no idea that she was asking for clothing for a newborn. One of his secretaries explained it to him, and he then had to determine if he should send a blue or pink one before deciding to go with a neutral white. They also had to plan for the eventual birth of the child. After Svetlana's due date of November 26 arrived, the RCMP had a car on standby with 2 Mounties ready to take her to town. When she went into labor, RCMP officer Merv Black was given a wad of cash to pay the hospital, and he adopted the cover of a husband who spoke little English. He took her to the hospital and answered questions in halted English. When questions got too personal, he took out the wad of cash and said, "I pay now." That ended the questions. By an unbelievable chance, though, the nurse assisting in the delivery room was the same one who had helped deliver Svetlana's first child in Ottawa. The woman kept saying she resembled a woman she had known in Ottawa, and Svetlana did her best to throw her off the scent. After the baby was born, the RCMP purchased a Christmas tree, decorated the farmhouse, and prepared a turkey dinner for everyone. Presents were brought in to give the family a good Christmas amid a troubling time. Amid all the festivities, the Canadian government tried to keep Gouzenko's defection a secret, but nothing can stay hidden forever. On February 3, 1946, the story broke in the news. But there was more to that story being released than meets the eye, and it all came down to 007's inspiration, the intrepid William Stevenson. Prime Minister King was still refusing to take action in protecting Gouzenko out of fear of angering the Soviets and starting a war. By now, King had been Prime Minister for almost 20 years. He was getting older, tired, and was actually only 4 years away from his own death. He didn't have the energy for an international incident and told MP Jack Pickersgill, "If we exploit this Gouzenko business, we are going to be the prime targets of the Soviet Union." William Stevenson was not about to let Gouzenko out of his hands, and things are easier to control when you're pulling the strings. He said, King refused to take the necessary action for fear of offending Stalin. Working with Ernest Cuneo, the American intelligence liaison, he had the story of Gouzenko's defection leak through the American newspaper and radio columnist Drew Pearson. The news flash stated, "This is Drew Pearson with a flash from Washington. Canada's Prime Minister Mackenzie King has informed President Truman of a very serious situation affecting our relations with Russia. A Soviet agent surrendered some time ago to Canadian authorities and confessed a gigantic Russian espionage network inside the United States." Now that the story was out, King had no choice but to act, and he immediately informed his cabinet about Gouzenko's defection. 3 days later, he created a royal commission to investigate Soviet espionage in Canada. He wrote in his diary, "I cannot interpret these events and how all of this has come direct to my own doorstep in any way other than in the play of world faces and unseen forces beyond that. I have been somehow singled out as an instrument on the part of unseen forces to bring about the exposure that has now taken place." On February 13, 1946, Gouzenko began to give evidence about Soviet espionage in Canada. He named multiple individuals in the Soviet spy ring, including Gordon Lunin, the speechwriter for Paul Martin Sr., Israel Halberton, a mathematics professor at Queen's University, and Fred Rose, a member of Parliament. With that information, the RCMP had to act quickly, and to do so they took advantage of the War Measures Act. Established in 1914, the Act gave the government emergency measures that included the suspension of civil liberties and personal freedoms. During the First World War, it was used to intern anyone deemed an enemy alien, which the government considered to be anyone who immigrated in the previous decade from Germany or Austro-Hungary. During the Second World War, it was used to intern Japanese Canadians from the British Columbian coast into camps, while the government stole their homes, businesses, and possessions. With the War Measures Act still in place in Canada in early 1946, the RCMP could use it to arrest those named in the documents provided by Gouzenko. Prime Minister King, who wasn't too bothered about the suspension of civil liberties of Japanese Canadians during the war, was now worried. He wrote in his diary, "I can see where a great cry will be raised, having had a commission sit in secret, and men and women arrested and detained under an order in council, passed really under war measures powers. I will be held up to the world as the very opposite of a democrat. It is part of the inevitable." At 6 a.m. on February 14, 1957, Cecil Bayfield with the RCMP gathered 44 members and informed them of their mission to drive out to the list of addresses, search out the buildings, and arrest the suspects in the Soviet spy ring case. Gordon Lunin was in London but was recalled on the claim he was being promoted. Upon landing in Montreal, he was quickly arrested. Fred Rose was not arrested on the day over worry of public backlash for arresting an elected official without charge. First elected in 1943 with the Labour Progressive Party, Rose was accused of leading a ring of over 20 Soviet spies who were looking to steal information related to the Manhattan Project that developed the first atomic bomb. After several others incriminated Rose, though, the decision was made to arrest him. At 11 p.m. on March 14th, while he was speaking with a Toronto Daily Star reporter on the phone, Fred Rose was arrested in his apartment. Due to the War Measures Act suspending civil liberties, none of those arrested knew why they were in handcuffs. Each went through severe interrogations and were held for days on end without charges. As a quick aside, it is no secret that Prime Minister King saw himself as a Christian crusader who had a dislike for Jewish people. In 1939, he denied entry to Canada to 907 Jewish refugees aboard the MS St. Louis and caused many to return to Europe, and there, 254 of them died in the Holocaust. Prime Minister King believed many of those arrested in the Gouzenko incident were Jewish communists, and he saw himself on the right side of history in the story of that. He wrote, "It is a rather extraordinary thing that most of those caught in this present net are Jews, or have Jewish wives or of Jewish descent. Only 4 of those arrested were actually Jewish, and 2 of those were acquitted. Of those arrested, 16 went through trials between 1946 and 1949, 7 of whom were acquitted due to lack of evidence. Gordon Lunin received 5 years, while Fred Rose was convicted and ejected from the House of Commons." After the arrests were made, Prime Minister King finally made a public statement about the Gouzenko affair, but he didn't identify the Soviet Union in his statement. 5 days after King's statement, the Soviets stated that while certain members of their embassy did obtain secret character information, the information was worthless. Every member of the embassy implicated in Gouzenko's documents were expelled by the Canadian government, including the man leading the Soviet ring at the embassy, Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Zabotin. Upon his return to the USSR, he was sent to a Siberian labor camp where he remained until he was released in 1953. His health broken by the Gulag, he died only a few years later. And he wasn't the only one to suffer because of Gouzenko's defection. Gouzenko's mother died in an NKVD prison while under investigation by the Soviets. Svetlana's father, mother, and sister were all sent to prison for 5 years, and her sister's daughter, Tatiana, was sent to an orphanage. Both Igor and Svetlana Gouzenko were tried in Russia, but despite not actually being in Russia, and were found guilty and sentenced to death. This meant the couple could never return to the Soviet Union, not that they were planning to. As for Fred Rose, he was released from prison in 1951. He attempted to build a life for himself in Montreal, but at each job, the RCMP told his employers and co-workers he was a convicted spy. In 1953, he moved to Poland, where he worked as a magazine editor. His Canadian citizenship was revoked in 1957, and he was unable to return to Canada to appeal the decision. Rose died on March 16, 1983, in Warsaw. Gouzenko became one of the most famous men in Canada, but no one really knew what he looked like as offers for a story were flooding in. Cosmopolitan offered $5,000 for an interview, which Gouzenko turned down. They kept coming back, offering more money until the figure reached $50,000, which Gouzenko accepted in November 1946. He also received $75,000 for the film rights to his story from 20th Century Fox. The movie was turned into The Iron Curtain, starring Gene Tierney and Dana Andrews. Filmed in Ottawa, Soviet sympathizers attempted to disrupt filming at various locations, but the film proved to be a financial hit, earning $2 million at the box office. Prime Minister King had also changed how he saw Gouzenko and agreed to meet with him and stated he was, quote, very pleased at the way in which he had conducted himself throughout the period of great anxiety. I appreciated his manliness, his courage, his standing for right. King offered Gouzenko a pension of $400 a month, or nearly $7,000 today. Gouzenko turned it down, believing he had more than enough money from Cosmopolitan and film deals. He fully expected more to come. Svetlana Gouzenko said, RCMP Assistant Commissioner Nicholson just gasped and flopped on the chair, surprised that the stupid young man refused a government pension. For Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom, the long-term ramifications of the Gouzenko affair continued for years. Gone was the belief the Soviets were allies, replaced with a suspicion that would dominate the next 4 decades as the Cold War began. The Red Scare of the 1950s, which often ruined innocent lives in the process, traces its origins back to the Gouzenko affair. Now, would have the Cold War and Red Scare have happened without Gouzenko? Almost certainly. But there's no question he helped usher in that era with his defection. But what about Gouzenko? After he shook the diplomatic world to its core, what happened to him? Igor and Svetlana were given Canadian citizenship and new identities. Together they raised 8 children and lived in Port Credit, Ontario. For the rest of his life, Gouzenko feared he would wake up one day with a gun pointed at him by a Soviet operative. But that day never came. The Soviets made no attempt to kill Gouzenko, and according to those close to Stalin, he forbade anyone from going after Gouzenko for fear of upsetting the West. Nonetheless, he was always convinced the RCMP assigned to protect him, as late as the 1960s, had been infiltrated by the KGB. Gouzenko and his wife settled into a normal suburban existence, and their children knew nothing of their Soviet background. They assumed their parents were Czech and even cheered for Czechoslovakia in the Olympics and hockey games. It was not until they were in their late teens they learned the truth. In 1948, Gouzenko published This Was My Choice, a book about his defection. This was followed by The Fall of a Titan, a novel about life under Stalin. The book won the Governor General's Literary Award for Fiction in 1954. It was also nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature. Throughout his life, whenever he made public appearances, Gouzenko always wore a hood to protect his identity. In 1958, he appeared on the panel show Front Page Challenge, wearing that trademark hood and with his voice disguised by technicians. On June 25, 1982, Gouzenko died of a heart attack in Mississauga. Svetlana died in 2001 and is buried next to her husband. Today, 2 plaques commemorate the defection of Gouzenko, located in Dundonald Park in Ottawa, across from where he and his family lived in an apartment prior to making the decision that changed the world. In 2002, then Federal Heritage Minister Sheila Copps designated the Gouzenko affair as an event of national historic significance. I hope you enjoyed that episode and our look at the Gouzenko affair. Next week, we're looking at the Stratford Festival. This show is researched, produced, and written by me, Craig Baird, with the help of Dila Velasquez. Audio production and design by Rosalind Kufor. If this is your first time listening and you like what you heard, please take a moment and give us a 5-star review to help other people find these amazing stories. And there are so many for you to sink your teeth into. If you enjoy this podcast, then please check out my other podcasts, From John to Justin, Canada, A Yearly Journey, Pucks and Cups, and Canada's Great War. We love hearing from you, so if you have a show topic you want me to cover, email me at craig@canadaehx.com or stop by my website and social media. I'll include all of those in my show notes. Until next time, I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X.